Welcome to another video on chess studies. 2 weeks back, I had done a video on how one should solve chess studies, but I had not given the entire solution. So in this video, I'm looking at explaining the solution to the problem that we discussed. So if you haven't yet seen the video, you can please go ahead and check it out so that you understand the logic behind how moves are calculated in the study. So without further ado, let's get started. The very first move here for white is knight c7. Now, if you've seen that video, you'll understand how we arrived at it. But to just kind of help you out, if black were to capture the knight, then all you have to do is push the pawn and there's absolutely nothing that black can do. Because even if he goes after chasing this, white promotes. And in case he decides to bring the king, it's still futile because white promotes. And once you promote, there's nothing much that can be done. The queen is going to be immensely stronger than the bishop, and the pawns to easily help white win the game. So in the absence of that, if the king doesn't want to capture it, what are his other options? So the king doesn't have any move per se. So if the king moves something like king d7, you can still push the pawn and it would lead to a very similar thing. Or if king d7, probably knight just captures bishop. So I think the bigger problem here is not about where the king can move, it's about where the bishop can move. So I have marked all the possible moves of the bishop. There's 7 possible moves that the bishop can move. And I've color coded them because 3 of them are marked in green precisely due to the possible consequence of that move is very, very similar. The ones in red are outright blunders because if you move the bishop to d5 or to f3, d5 the knight captures straight away, f3 the king captures. And I've also marked a square in blue and orange because they are slightly different. So let's take one example of a green square. For example, let's say he moves here. Then all you need to do is ensure that there's a zugzwang move. So you push the pawn forward, threatening promotion. So the only possible move is in here. And now you can move the knight to e6, threatening promotion. And there's absolutely nothing that black can do because if he captures the knight, the pawn promotes. And if he captures the pawn, you can pause the video here and think about a very simple tactic, which is nothing but a fork between the king and the bishop. And king moving anywhere is just going to lead to the bishop getting captured and therefore the game moving on, with white, of course, winning the game. So now, if the bishop moves to any of the green squares, it's very similar. So you can actually, again, pause the video here and think about what happens if the bishop were to move to b7 or e4. It would be very, very similar. So b7 and c6 are very similar. The knight just has to come to the same d8 square while forking after he captures. So let's try and do it for the e4 square. So again, it's the same idea. You push the pawn, you're about to promote. King comes here to prevent it. You come here to threaten the checkmate. I mean the promotion. King takes it, and only this time the fork is on the other side. But nevertheless, it pretty much comes to the exact similar situation. And given that white still has the pawn on a2 means that eventually white would win the game. So I hope you're able to see why the green squares are bad, because in each of the green squares there's going to be a potential fork between the bishop and the king, and therefore white would win. The red squares are direct blunders. So the only difference here though is g2. And remember my definition of intelligence, knowing similarities between differences and differences between similarities. G2 is very, very different because there's a slight change. For example, if you were to blindly move the pawn here and the king comes here and you do the exact same maneuver, then there's absolutely nothing, because once king takes it, you don't have a fork. So in this case, it's different than the other squares that we saw. So when bishop comes to g2, you need to play one move, which is to threaten it. But here's a problem with this. When the bishop comes here, and now if you threaten to promote, king comes here, and if you do this, then black wins the game, because now you can't protect your pawn. Even promoting it to a queen basically means king captures it, and eventually you would lose the pawn, and in fact black might end up winning the game. So there's a small change here, which is you don't move the king right away, you move the knight first and give a check. Now thankfully the pawn is controlling this square, so the king has to come here. Now you move the king here, and he has multiple options. As you can see, this is going to be a fork if he goes back here, because it's a direct check, it's a fork. This is also a fork. These two squares are going to eventually lead to the same fork after pushing the pawn. So you push the pawn. So let's take an example. If the bishop comes here, you give a check, king captures or forced to capture. Now you give a check and it's a fork. I hope you understand that. So this again has the same problem of a fork. You push the pawn, king takes it, and you have it. These are direct blunders, and this of course is the one that we'll consider next. And this one again is a fork. Why? Because now when he moves it, you can actually push the pawn, king takes it, you give a check, and you are able to capture the bishop after the fork. So as you can see, when you go back and start off with the initial one, the blue one is slightly different because it still needs you to make that subtle change of first bringing the knight to e6 before pushing the pawn to e7. So knowing that eventually g2 also means that the only possible move is h1, the bishop would probably move directly to h1. Right? And even in this case, all you have to do is move the king here, and the same threats still exist, that he cannot go to these squares because they are direct captures, and the king doesn't have many moves, so he can't capture the knight because the pawn would still push forward and become a queen, and the bishop is out of moves. So this is a true Zugzwang study, because he's running out of moves. The pawns can't move for black, the king can't move because he can't come near. The e file is cordoned off, so the king can't come anywhere near. He can't capture the knight because the moment he captures the knight, you push the pawn. So his only square is going to be to move king d7, which is what he would do, because remember, if the bishop comes to any of the red squares as a direct capture, any of the green squares, it's going to be an eventual fork. So if he moves the king, all you have to do now is to move the king here, and again you have the same possibilities of red and green squares. The red squares are direct captures, green squares are forks. So if the bishop were to come here, for example, you push the pawn, threaten, king has to come here, bring the knight to e6, king captures, it's a fork, and you get the bishop. So I hope you were able to understand how this study can be solved. As you can see, it's not a very simple study. This is definitely designed for advanced students to solve, and it brings in a very important element of chess thinking, which is selection and elimination, right? So when you're a beginner, it's easier to select the right move just based on patterns, but as you become an advanced player, you will have to do a lot more of elimination to decide on what is the best move for you, as well as predict what is the best move for your opponent. And that takes time, and that's one of the reasons why we see kids or grandmasters play 5-hour and 6-hour games. Gukesh played a 6-hour game in the recently concluded candidate tournaments. So that amount of time is needed to do this level of calculation. So doing studies will definitely help you build your calculation abilities in chess. I hope you found this video useful. If so, please do share, subscribe, and click on the bell icon. Thank you so much. Until I see you next.